It's an Archaeodeath Interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome, Archaeodeathlings, to my fourth Archaeodeath interview, and I'm very pleased and excited to have with me today Dr. Ali Klevnäs from the University of Stockholm. Now, Ali is I've known for over a decade and a half, so back into the dawn of time, back before the coronavirus anyway, and we've been sort of pursuing very parallel routes in some ways, but also very different careers in other fashions. And so I'm now that I've got this YouTube channel, it's a really great opportunity to be able to get Ali on here and to hear about her expertise and her research and her teaching, and hopefully some general broader views about maybe the future of where mortuary archaeology is going. So welcome, Ali.
Thanks, Howard. It's very nice to talk to you. I realised actually that although I've known you for a long time, I haven't in fact seen you and talked to you for years. Even though we wrote a paper together, we actually just communicate in writing. So it's nice to have a chat.
Of course. I mean, I have so many compartments in my brain, and people fit into so many of them, and I think of you I've talked to you about various different projects and about reading your research. I may have been a peer reviewer at various points, and and then also knowing you in terms of your and then of course we wrote a paper together, and that was one of the sort of something I wasn't actually going to actually discuss, because I sort of kind of buried that in the back of my mind and thinking other things. But yes, of course. And we've done all of that digitally, which is sad and good at the same time.
It's very effective.
I mean, and I couldn't get to the Nordic tag that you would have been at, because you were organising that, weren't you? And I couldn't get there for personal reasons. And was it you that was me in proxy, or was it someone else? I can't remember.
I read your paper. That was a very strange experience, actually, trying to kind of pretend to be somebody else to present their words. But it was fine.
Well, thank you for being me. It must have been a traumatic experience, and you've survived clearly. I was Josh Pollard once, and it was never a bad thing for me. But thank you anyway. For that. And I just wanted to really have a conversation with you about mortuary archaeology, early medieval archaeology, and also this interview to provide an opportunity for people to learn about you and perhaps get a sense of the kind of journeys that different academics have taken to get where they are today. So I wanted to ask you, how did you get into archaeology, and why mortuary archaeology in particular?
Yeah, and I was trying to think about what the answer to that actually was, like how that had happened. So in really practical kind of career terms, I've been back and forwards across the North Sea. So I did my undergraduate in the UK in Cambridge, and then I went over to Sweden to do a master's at Uppsala University. In those days, that's 2003, 2004, Neil Price and Stefan Brink were running a master's program at Uppsala called Viking and Early Medieval Studies, which was a really great focused master's. I think Alex Sandmark took it over afterwards and was able to run it for a few years before she went to Scotland. And so I think that was a really fun and an inspiring kind of course to do. Several people, in fact, who nowadays work with early medieval archaeology did it. So Florent Audi, who works at the History Museum in Stockholm with coins, he did it. Cecilia Jung, who's just finished some research on early Sigtuna, she did that course. So from that point of view, I think it was a really kind of successful course in producing people who continued to do research. And it also, of course, had the great advantage of being free, because higher education in Sweden is free. So it was a bit of a no-brainer to come over and do that. And then I went back across the North Sea to do my PhD in Cambridge with Catherine Hills as my supervisor. And I made that decision because I got funding, basically. And so obviously that wasn't a good place to do it. PhDs in Sweden are a very attractive option because they're 4 years and they are fully salaried. They're paid as jobs with all of the rights that go along with that, to parental leave and sick leave and so on. But there are not very many of them. So, I mean, in Stockholm, we advertise usually 2 general archaeology PhD places a year. So, but that's one of the, I think we're perhaps the university in Sweden that has most of those positions. So, right, back across the North Sea for PhD. And then once I had finished my PhD, and I had also had 2 children during it, we then decided that we would live in Sweden again. It's a good place to have a young family. And then I got a postdoc position in Stockholm. So I've been there now for nearly 9 years, first as a postdoc, and then in a couple of temporary fixed-term senior lectureships and research projects, and so on.
Wow. So
But
yes, it is back and forth. I completely forgot about the master's aspect, and I kind of, again, something I kind of vaguely knew about you, but I forgot that jump back and forth. And so yes, Stefan I've only known from conferences, and Neil mainly likewise. And but 2 inspirational, very different researchers, but still, they've that would have been a wonderful combo. And obviously coming from Cambridge as an undergraduate and then going back there and working with Catherine. I mean. As I did my PhD at Reading, but Catherine was so supportive when I was doing my PhD. That would have been an experience too. So and you survived it all and went back to Sweden and through many transitions and many posts. So I mean, where did the thesis go though? I mean, obviously the Cambridge thesis, it became a book. It was a 2013 book, wasn't it, if I remember rightly?
It was. Do you know, I've even got it here. I've got my little heat.
Show everyone. Everyone needs to buy it. Buy copies. Buy multiple copies.
You can also email me.
There you are. Grave
So,
robbery.
Yeah. Okay. So that was like the kind of career terms thing. And in terms of research, so let me see. Grave reopening is what I do, right? Graves that have post-depositional secondary interventions, traditionally known as grave robbing. So that goes back a really long way for me. When I was a teenager, I grew up in Kent, in southeast England, and there I learned to excavate with the Kent Archaeological Society, working on a Roman villa in Minster in Thanet, which was super fun. And they're kind of working on that dig for a few summers and chatting to people and having all of those kind of around the fire conversations that people do. One of the things that people talked about was that in the area, there were early medieval burials, Anglo-Saxon burials, which had been messed about with. So they had been reopened and people had done peculiar things to them, probably very soon after they had been buried. Dave Perkins, who was a very prolific excavator in Kent, was one of the people teaching on these excavations, and he had excavated a lot of these disturbed burials. In fact, many other people had too, but he was the person who had really published them and written about them and got interested in them. So I kind of had that in the back of my mind always, that there was this strange phenomenon that people went into these early medieval graves and did peculiar stuff to them. So then many years later, when I was in Uppsala doing my master's and trying to work out what I would write my dissertation on, I happened across the excavation report by Elsa Nordahl of some boat graves at Gamla Uppsala. So behind the Great Mounds at Gamla Uppsala, there are these, a small group of Viking age boat burials. Which in any other context people would get really excited about, but because they're behind the Great Mounds at Gamla Uppsala, nobody really notices them. But in the excavation report, it just sort of mentions that, oh, by the way, this was reopened really soon after the burial, they moved all the stuff around. You can see that it happens super early because they're able to do stuff like lift up the dog and move it, and so it's still whole. So it just kind of gets mentioned in this report that this happened really early. I thought that raises a lot of questions for me. You know, why did this happen? Why was this okay? What was the motivation? Why was it just left in a mess? All kinds of questions. I wanted to know how common that was and so on. So that sent me into a whole, so far a whole career of curiosity about reopened burials and why people go into them. So I mean, yes, absolutely. We are aware that it is in fact very normal for people, it's very common for people to go back to mortuary contexts and interact with artifacts and human remains again. We know that obviously Neolithic tombs are designed to facilitate that kind of interaction. We have all the classic anthropology, so for example from Madagascar, where people have repeated festivals going in and dancing with the dead and so on. We know all of this, we know that this happens, but nonetheless, there are lots of periods where we somehow regard that as abnormal. And the early medieval period is one of those where we have not expected to see that kind of secondary interaction. And when it has been there, it's often been seen as a problem, as kind of removing evidentiary potential from burials, taking something away from archaeologists. And you see that time and time again in the documentation. Oh no, this one's been robbed. But I think in a wide range of contexts, archaeologists are increasingly recognizing that actually these kind of episodes where people go back into burials and do more with them, even if they take objects out, which they do in the early medieval period, in some ways we can gain more information from the ways in which they interact with those burials. So there's another book here, which I'm going to show you. So this one, which I edited very recently with Edeltraud Asperg and Niels Müller-Schiessel. That has case studies from a whole range of periods and places where secondary interventions in burials have been labelled as grave robbery, but actually can tell us much more about why burials were created as they were in the first place, what mattered in those burials, what was important, and what was of continued importance to the people who lived around the burials. So then, so I got excited about all of this doing that master's, and I wrote a master's thesis on written sources and archaeological evidence for disturbance of Vendel and Viking period burials in Sweden. So I kind of started getting into that. And there's loads of written sources. This is much, people are really quite aware of this with sort of the Åseberg robbing and so on, and all of the saga stories.
Yeah.
There's sort of relatively, there's quite a strong signal on the archaeological radar about reopening of Vendel and Viking period graves in Scandinavia. But then for my PhD, I went back to being interested in those strange Anglo-Saxon examples, the burials in Kent, which had been messed around with. So at that point, I wanted to know, was that actually true? Those sort of rumours that I'd heard, what was the basis for those? What was going on with that? Was that, in fact, related to what I had seen in Scandinavia? Was it related to what I now knew about, which was that in the Merovingian kingdoms, we have recognised for a long time that practices of reopening burials and going into them, taking objects out, that they're super common. So I wanted to know whether the Kent examples were in fact part of that same phenomenon. And the short answer is they are. They're totally the same thing. So then for my thesis, I collected all of the examples in England of reopened early medieval burials and compared them to what happens in the Merovingian kingdoms. Wanting to know when it happens, how it happens, ideally why.
And do you have a sound bite, or is it it's complicated answer?
That's definitely a complicated answer.
Yeah, indeed. And but the very fact that it's a cross-channel phenomenon, I mean, one level, surely this is just another example of our poor how nationalism affects our divisions in scholarship today, how we tend to see Merovingian and Anglo-Saxon or early medieval archaeology in England as different sort of fields of inquiry, and yet Kent is so close to the continent, and this is another strand of connection. Is that is that a fair thing to say? I mean,
Definitely.
Good. I mean, it's such a go on.
No, actually, but that's really interesting. The kind of why. So it's a super well-established phenomenon in the Merovingian kingdoms, especially in German-speaking archaeology, but also in French, although French and German scholars on it haven't really talked to each other. But it is, everyone knows about it. And people excavated in Kent at, really a lot of the sites in Kent, people found it. And multiple site directors discovered it on multiple episodes of excavation, very unequivocal evidence. And so why that wasn't regarded as kind of an archaeological fact, I think it's quite interesting that it didn't for a long time. And of course, you do get odd ideas coming out of archaeology and from excavations, right? I mean, we were, you do, yes. But that it didn't, I think, is to do with quite a poor publication record in the county, which people are working hard to rectify, so that it ended up with really only one site director publishing his findings on this. And therefore, do you want to be the one guy who thinks he's found grave robbery when nobody else is publishing on it? It's quite an uncomfortable place to be.
Yeah. And there is inertias as well. I mean, I recall a certain other early medieval burial academic being told when he came up with his idea to look at his topic and being told, you will find no evidence. That was the determination. And I work hard with thinking of my students about, I worry about that myself. Will I fall into that trap of saying, oh no, you'll never find anything on that, and putting people off really potentially good topics? Because what you're trying to do in guiding potential topic areas is, that you don't want them going down a rabbit hole or down a cul-de-sac and wasting their time, and yet equally you want to foster those new areas. And this may be one of those where so many people are sort of going, oh, I don't think there'll be much of that, or I know about one case, but it's unlikely, and then everyone just steers clear of it for such a long time until someone goes, right, I not only know this is a thing, but I'm going to investigate it systematically. And that's what makes it such an exciting piece of work, I think, and that's really cool.
Yeah, and that would have affected my research design. If I had realised how many of those disturbed graves there were, I would have started writing that thesis differently. I certainly wouldn't have had the approach. I thought that I was going to be describing 10 or 20 graves in detail, and ended up being like more than 200. And I would have had a different and more systematic approach to it had I known that from the start.
Well, I mean, all research projects have, you can't predict. I mean, it's nice it goes that way rather than the other way, if you looking and finding only 2 or something. But that's you're victim of your own success.
or the success of whoever opens.
Victim of other people's success. Yes. So what happened then? What was the next part of your journey then? So you went back to you went back to Sweden, and how did you continue your grave robbing interests?
So the next thing, let me see. Yes, so I went back to Sweden and was very lucky to get a position as a postdoctoral researcher at Stockholm, because such jobs are also rare. And so I was super lucky that one came up and I was able to get it just at that point that worked in my life. And there, the research that I carried out was actually going back to what I had done in my master's and publishing on Scandinavian material. So there I published a paper about the disturbance of the boat graves at Vendel. So Vendel is this really iconic Vendel and Viking period site in central Sweden, where there are incredibly high status boat graves, a series of them made over some hundreds of years. And they have these amazing, famous helmets in and so on. But in fact, most of those burials had at some point been dug into and a lot of the contents removed. So the helmets come from the undisturbed ones, but most of them are disturbed. And so I wanted to look at the evidence for when that had happened, how it had happened, and something I think I'm able to say about probably why it happened. And that is that this is a reopening that happened relatively late in the history of the site, quite possibly in connection with, so when the graves are already sort of well rotted and so on. The excavator thought, with good reason, that it might have happened in connection with the building of the church, which is adjacent to the site, because of finds of material from the church building fairly deep in those graves. And so I think it may well have been something to do with the Christianization of the site.
So they're not knocking them out of significance, or is that the idea, just erasing them, or is it a more targeted thing, do you think, or you can't tell?
Targeted thing.
Yeah.
So that's actually very interesting, that you can see at that site the people who did the reopening learning about the layout of the graves as they go around. So on the surface, you can see that there are boat-shaped hollows now, and presumably also then, and they learn to go for the part of the grave that has the main deposit, that has the body and the object that are immediately around the body. And so you can actually sort of trace it on the plan of the cemetery that they work around, learning about that and removing the central deposits. So they're digging out the human remains and the objects that are most closely associated with the physical person. And they just dig those out. They leave the graves. So they're very kind of targeted in what they want to take out. It's taking out that core and most meaningful part of the grave, but they are leaving the graves in the sense of sort of monuments are still there in the landscape.
But it's not just random treasure hunting then. There is or would you, it is about the sort of an awareness of a tension between these graves and what they're trying to build with the church, do you think?
Yes.
Yeah, it's more religiously motivated.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
So I published that one, and then I wrote a paper for the European Journal of Archaeology volume that you edited on citations in Viking studies, Viking archaeology. So that's about the fact that I don't think this is very common in Viking and Vendel burials, especially boat graves. There are. Sorry, I just have to have a drink.
That's right.
So that's about the fact that reopening is actually very common in Vendel and Viking period graves, especially boat graves. The Vendel case is not in any way unique, and I was looking at the similarities and differences in the ways that that's been carried out and the kind of timing of it across a variety of Viking and Vendel period burials, and especially the way that it is these particular kinds of possession that are taken out of the graves, the ones that are very closely connected with the body of the dead.
So you have, yeah, it's really, so you have this kind of different motives at different times. They may be doing similar things, but they may be doing different kinds of motivation, and that it's not just a random process. It's they're carefully aware of what they're trying to achieve in different cases. That's fascinating. So you have, would you say there are clear regional differences, or is our evidence not good enough to support seeing it as such a stark way of this region does one thing or this time does another thing, or is it more messy than that?
I think I would rather say that what's quite surprising about it in Scandinavia is that no, there aren't regional differences. When you're looking at these really high status graves like Orseberg and Gokstad and Larby, you're seeing repeated activities that are very similar, that you have really quite surprising levels of violence directed against the grave and the person of the dead. And you have the particular kinds of items that are closely associated with the body taken out. In that article, I also stepped kind of well out of my comfort zone and discussed some of the literature as well. So the saga stories about going into graves and taking objects from the dead, which I actually think are related to the reopening of Viking period graves, not least because that reopening in fact happens quite late. Which puts it closer to the saga stories than you might think. I mean, some of it, even there are sites in Norway where we can see that the reopening is probably happening into the 13th century. Yeah. So that was.
I hadn't thought of it. I mean, even though I obviously read and was involved in that paper, I hadn't actually thought about it as a sort of soundbiting it in that way. That almost what we could say about what we understand from the sagas and later sources, we should be more confident perhaps about their grave robbing escapades than anything else about what they think may have happened in Viking period burial rituals in many ways.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Neil talks about this, and I think he's absolutely right, that it's interesting that when sagas describe Viking period burials, they do it very accurately, right? And in some considerable detail. They're describing rituals that have not happened for a couple of centuries at least.
So it's almost archaeological in a sense, because they're aware of finding these traces of sacrificed animals and weapons and feasting gear of different kinds. Yeah. Wow. So where did things go from the European Journal of Archaeology, Ali?
What else did I do? Let me see. So I'd written that thesis on early medieval burials that had been disturbed I'd written that thesis on burials that had been disturbed in the early Middle Ages in Kent, comparing them with Merovingia. And then gradually, I discovered that there were other people who were also working on the same phenomenon. So since I did that work, or let me see, Edeltraud Asberg in Austria, just as I was starting my PhD, published a very heavily reopened cemetery in Lower Austria. And so I got in touch with her. And then since I finished my thesis, or while I was working on my thesis, Stephanie Zintel in Bavaria was looking at a group of reopened cemeteries. And so we got in touch. And then Martina van Harperen in the Low Countries was looking at a number of cemeteries with reopening there. And Astrid Noteman in France looked at about 50 cemeteries which had reopening. And she was particularly applying archaeothanatological approaches to understanding what had happened. And so the five of us all got in touch gradually. So these were all completely independent projects, but we in fact all shared an approach, as it turns out, that we were all really interested in kind of detailed taphonomical understanding of what had happened to these graves as a way of finding interpretations for what people were up to. So why this had happened. So we had a lot to talk about. So we got together and started a sort of fairly informal research group. We have a website called reopenedgraves.eu. So that we got together in order to start publishing together and applying for research projects together. And then what happened? So yeah, we organised a conference, 2017. Lots of people came to Stockholm and all talked about early medieval grave reopening, which was really fun. And on the basis of that, we applied for money. It was only Astrid and I who were available to do a research project at that stage, but we got funding for a 3-year project from the Swedish Research Council to really bring together the work of these 5 researchers and compare it and look at the phenomenon across Europe at that kind of bigger perspective. So that's what we're doing now. And so, yeah, I think I need another question.
Well, I was just thinking about, so you've now got this book out, you've got, you've got the website, which I'll put I was going to say for everyone, all of this is going to be in the descriptor below, all of Ali's key publications, so you can go browse and her website and everything else. But I was wanting to ask you about where things are. I mean, is grave reopening a continued interest, or are you moving into new areas in early medieval European burial archaeology, or a bit of both?
So grave reopening is totally a continuing interest.
Right.
We're running this 3-year project and bringing together perspectives from all of these different researchers.
Yeah.
We just had a paper accepted in Antiquity, which is great. So we're quite excited about that.
Oh, fantastic.
Which will bring it all together. And it's obviously those papers are very short, but they give that big perspective and say, look, all over Europe, from Romania to Kent, we've got this reopening. We need to take it into consideration in the mortuary practices of the period. And also it's quite informative about what is important to people.
Yes.
It's also, so one of the things that I think is super interesting about it is that you have a shared burial practice across that area, this kind of furnished inhumation, often with weapons. And that starts in the 5th century, but the reopening doesn't. It starts all over this area. It starts in the later 6th century. So it shows us something about how in touch these communities are over quite a wide area, that they are creating a new kind of practice which then becomes shared. So I think that's quite interesting. So we published that. We're publishing various other papers about the different aspects of the reopening, methodological stuff about archaeothanatology and the recognition and study of reopened burials. I'm trying to write a paper, which I'm finding quite difficult, about the kind of emotional trajectory of early medieval burial, which I know is something that you've written about.
Oh, I'd love to read that. Yeah.
Well, as soon as I have a shareable draft, I shall send it to you. So about how reopening how we can see reopening as part of or working against that kind of emotional trajectory. So lots of things going on there.
So of all these research projects you've worked on about grave reopening, can you give us a sort of any sense of what the motive was for these early medieval people? Why, from the late 6th century across Europe, were they going back into graves?
Yes, I can, I hope. So, right. So one of the oh god, not here. Okay, I'm just gonna have to think about it for a second, and then you can edit.
Yeah. It's really difficult to do these things, isn't it?
It's surprisingly difficult. I don't feel like my working memory is that good these days. Okay, yes, I can, absolutely. So as you've said, from the kind of late 6th century, there's a relatively short period of some decades where people do this. And it's towards the end of the furnished burial practice over this area. The easiest thing, in fact, is to answer with some of the things that this is not. So there was always a sense that this was probably some kind of robbing for material gain, because we know that when people reopen these burials, what they do is they go straight for the artifacts. So they're aiming to take particular things out of these graves. They don't dig up the whole grave. They don't try and hide the fact that there was a grave. They're not particularly interested in the human remains. They're pretty specific, pretty targeted, pretty efficiently going for the artifacts. So that's true, they are doing that. But at the same time, it isn't a kind of robbing to maximize material gain.
Right.
They're taking quite selected artifacts, and they leave some really nice stuff in these burials. So I think there's an example in Kent, which I always like to show people, where there's a lovely big fat gold coin that they've left, for example. And especially in England, in Kent, where we have most of the reopening, they don't take women's necklaces, even when those have lovely pendants on them of silver and gold and so on. And even where we can see from the remains that they have been able to pick up and move necklaces. So they're still whole, they've totally seen them, they've probably handled them. They're still not taking those items. So this isn't a question of, with each reopening, you want to get as much stuff as possible. That's not the case.
Okay.
Rather, they quite selectively take swords, and they take women's brooches. So you don't find, or almost never find, reopened graves with swords in them, and almost never with brooches either. So they're after quite particular objects. There's also, of course, the degree to which this is a bad thing to do, reopening a grave, is always one of the big questions. Personally, I've seen it quite negatively. In my thesis and some of my subsequent work, I thought of it as being kind of some kind of tit for tat revenge kind of action, that almost a little bit like blood feud, and to do with that this is a period in Kent where we can see that power is becoming concentrated, and that this is something to do with those kind of power conflicts, to do with kin and the concentration of power within particular kin networks. That's how I've seen it. In fact, now that we have the bigger European perspective, I think perhaps I would be less inclined to a negative explanation, even though in lots of ways it looks super negative, because you really mess up these graves. People put so much effort in early medieval graves, right, to creating a lovely burial tableau with the all the objects arranged in their kind of more or less set places around the body. It's all very neatly laid out, and then the reopeners go in and they mess that up terribly. They just dig through it. They totally don't care. They leave items in the fill, they chuck stuff around. But nonetheless, it may well not be that negative a kind of act. It is so common and so widespread. And we can see that it, in fact, may be associated with the success of a burial place. So Stephanie Zintel in Bavaria has a really interesting example in these two cemeteries very close to each other in Burg Weintin in Bavaria, Burg Weintin Schule and Burg Weintin Kirchfeld. They're both established about 500 AD, which is a very common time for cemeteries to be established. And they're super similar. Like, they have the same kinds of burials. There's nothing particularly distinguishing them, except at one of them, practices of reopening start. So as people bury each other there through the later 6th century and into the 7th century, at one of the sites, you also get graves reopened, and reopening happens to one burial at a time. It's not a kind of mass event. So
Right.
people are burying and they're reopening alongside each other for some decades. And that cemetery is successful. That becomes quite a big cemetery. It carries on. Whereas the other cemetery, practices of reopening do not start. And that one fades away. It's a very short-lived, very small cemetery. That's quite interesting, I think. So then the choice of objects, I think, really matters. That's something that I got into quite a lot. I published a paper in 2015 in a book I edited together with Charlotte Heerden-Ferne Jonsson.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, about the idea of possession and belongings, because the objects that are taken from these graves are ones that are associated with kin networks. They're the kind of objects that we call inalienable objects that we feel pass part of an early medieval person's personhood around and connect people across generations. So it's quite specific kinds of possession that are taken from the graves. And I think that holds, I think I stand by that, whether one considers that interaction and recovery of those objects to be something that's positive or negative.
Now, I see your point there, and that's another, as well as an important idea. That's another book that we should flag up, and I'll put in the descriptor because open access, isn't it? I think it's
It is. It's online. Yeah. I'll wave it. So
hey,
yeah, I got that one too. So it has a beautiful cover.
Yeah, lovely.
A PhD student in our department, Anna Rust, designed it. I was so clever. These people who can do these designs.
Oh, I know Anna. She's been on another project I've done on cremation. Yes, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because she's a Bronze Age cremation expert.
Yeah.
But it's an attractive book if you like books, but it's also just freely available online.
Fantastic. But you have another area of interest developing as well, or?
Yeah. So having worked on that project, which is quite a kind of wide scale project across Europe, which incidentally is a really difficult thing to do during a pandemic, really not ideal. Having worked on that kind of very wide scale, I'm now interested in the questions of scale in interpretation in early medieval archaeology, because in that project we're working very much from kind of individual instances of reopening. You have to look at the detailed taphonomy of every grave and then build it up into a big picture of a practice that's over a huge area.
Yeah.
The next thing that I'm going to do once we finish this project at the end of this year, is together with Emma Brownlee, who is a researcher at the University of Cambridge, and Astrid Noteman, who I'm working together with on this project, we're going to be writing a textbook, which will be a kind of entry-level text about early medieval burial practices across Europe. So very exciting, also quite daunted about this. It was one of these crazy ideas which suddenly becomes reality. But all of us have conducted this kind of big scale research across different national borders and so on, and want to facilitate that for students and researchers, to make, for people who want to. I think for early medieval archaeology, I mean, you have to have your area of expertise, right, where you really know the material culture, you really know the practices, but you need to place that into a bigger context as well. And that can be quite difficult for language reasons and for all the kind of practical reasons of knowing where other people's archives are and how their databases work and what kinds of practices there are in an area, what you're wanting to look at. So some of it is about that kind of facilitating research, but also we want to write this book very much as a kind of from the ground up archaeology. So starting with the graves, starting with the sites, talking about how archaeologists work with them, how they interpret them, what kind of evidence they look for, how they build up a picture from those. In a lot of areas of Europe, you still, if you want to start to ask, okay, what was burial practice like? You still get an answer that is basically about characterizing the cultural history of an ethnic group. And we want to do this the other way around, to say what is found here and then how is it interpreted, and what kind of picture of life and society can we build up, and how and why do we do that?
I'm going to learn a lot from these future projects, both the grave reopening and the this new project, and that's I think one of the things that excites me as a teacher and a researcher. I simultaneously, when I hear about these projects, I'm going, I can use that in teaching here. I want to learn about this because we all have so many gaps in our knowledge, and I think there's so little sympathy for trying to write these broader syntheses, and yet they're so important because we're all working, we all need them to build our own research on. And huge areas of Europe I have very little knowledge about. I mean, I am confined linguistically and chronologically to my areas. And I think one of the things that's been great about early medieval British archaeology is we've had some new books that are deliberately trying to look again at different kinds of region and regionality, and also we've seen new books come out that don't focus just on England, or don't just focus on Ireland. So I think there's been a lot of attempts to break this down, but that scale, no, nothing. I think that's going to be really, really valuable. But so I'm looking forward to all of this. I mean, how can I mean, unless you've got anything additionally you want to add, I was going to ask, how does this link into your teaching as a university-based academic? You're not just doing the research, you're busy with so much else. So how does this link in?
Do you know, to an astonishing extent, it does not. So over the 9 years in Stockholm, I've done lots of different teaching at all different levels, from undergraduate, a lot at masters, and also quite a lot at PhD level, on different topics and sort of different kinds of course. Not in fact ever about my real area of expertise of early medieval burial. But lots of different things. So when I arrived, I started teaching the master's theory courses, for example. So I taught theory for several years, many years, and running the master's dissertation courses. And that's been super interesting because I supervise lots of master's dissertations now on different topics, and also some PhDs. And that, I think, I mean, you get so much input, right? You're learning yourself all of the time when you're seeing people start those research journeys. That's super fun. And then I've been teaching things like the Viking Age evening course, which we run in Stockholm, which is super cool because that's open to everybody, a lot of international students, a lot of just interested public, pensioners, quite a lot of Swedish pensioners like to do it. Some people who are, for example, reenactors, who really have very detailed specialist knowledge already, as well as international students who may know almost nothing about European history. And also our own PhD students do it. So super varied student group, but that was a very enjoyable course to teach. I think you a lot of energy from that course. So I have been teaching about the Viking Age, which obviously I've written about, but not in fact about early medieval Europe very much.
So you end up sort of not. I find this, that I don't find that teaching interacts with my research in unconscious ways. That you're forced to think about things differently because you're having to communicate it, even if it's on a different period or theme. But then of course, there are huge areas where I'm researching I've never taught, and or the other way around. I'm teaching things that I hope I never end up researching because I just don't have the grasp of some of the stuff I end up teaching. But it's frustrating but fun in different ways, I find. But I don't know if that's your feeling.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, so the last few years I've worked on a PhD sort of research school. The humanities faculty at Stockholm runs these research schools, which have PhD students across the faculty, so all different kind of humanities subjects. Archaeology is classified as the humanities at Stockholm. So one of those was about body theory, corporeality in theory and action, that was called. And so teaching about that kind of theory at PhD level is super useful for my own research and thinking about bodies in graves and people doing things and so on. I taught a course called The Body at Work with an early modern historian.
Oh, wow.
It was so far out of archaeology and so stimulating, and working with really sort of inspirational colleagues and things like that has been great. And then I ran another research school which was about materiality. So that, of course, was again pretty directly interesting for me, and useful to have to do that with PhD students in literature, in music, all different kind of subject areas, all very mind expanding. And now I'm running one on digital humanities, which is more relevant than one might think, because in fact there's a lot of kind of digital development in archaeology generally. It's always been one of the kind of forefront subjects for digital humanities, but specifically for early medieval graves, early medieval burial studies, that we have this kind of big data challenge there. And people have been coming up with various ways of dealing with that.
So, I think that's a really important area. Yes. Yeah. So go on. Sorry.
Oh, no. So yeah, I mean, you have unexpected crossovers between thinking in your teaching and in research, I think.
I think that does that question. And I suppose what I want to now ask is, as a academic archaeologist, a university-based archaeologist who specialises in burials, or maybe you want to answer this question just more broadly as an academic archaeologist, what do you think are the best and the worst things about your work? What are the things that you honestly think are good and challenging or negative?
About being an academic archaeologist?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll go with the bad things first.
Okay.
I think that it's the career structures is super difficult in employment.
Yeah.
So there are different problems in different places. In Sweden, this is very difficult because there's no kind of mid-career career structure. So there are postdocs and there are senior lectureships, but people tend to get those when they are about 50 and have effectively qualified themselves to become professors. And between postdoc and that position, people are kind of surviving on research projects and different bits and pieces of teaching. So that's really difficult. And I think, I mean, obviously the profession loses a lot of people at that point. Yeah. And had I been solely responsible for financing my household, then I would have had to move to more secure employment. In fact, I've been continuously employed, but there's a big element of luck in that.
I don't want to take anything away from that, but actually to contextualize it and emphasize it. Do you feel that's a particular thing of archaeology, or is that academia in Sweden generally? I mean, much of what you say applies in the UK too, but I mean, it's difficult to work out, what's specific about archaeology.
So I understand from, the reports by the unions in Sweden, for example, that this is a problem that is generally applicable to universities, to all disciplines. However, it's probably particularly acute in archaeology because there are so few jobs.
Right. Okay. So it's the size of the discipline sort of concentrates the problem even more.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
That's really okay. I think that's really helpful, because we when we're in our different sort of avenues, we see people saying, "Oh, it's really difficult," and while I don't want to sort of make less of it, it's important people understand the context. Yes, it is elsewhere, but the subject size is the problem, and I think that's true of the UK as well, because we have a commercial sector, sure, but in terms of the academic sector, we have benefits in the academic sector, but it also has that incredibly long career path, and it's only getting more challenging. I mean, is things getting better in Sweden? On the contrary, is it, or is it still a pernicious, challenge, a tenacious challenge?
I don't think things are necessarily getting better.
Okay.
although, I mean, there's a lot of discussion because effectively the university sector, so Sweden has very good employment rights generally,
Yeah.
but if the university sector gets away with having pretty shockingly poor employment rights. And so there's a lot of discussion about how we've ended up there and what should be done about it. A lot of discussion so far in the time I've been here, not much action, but we shall see how that develops. And I think it will take, it'll take action from university leaderships, and it isn't necessarily a problem for them.
No, that's the thing. There's a lot of inertia, I imagine. So is that cover all the bad, or is that the main thing that comes to your mind?
My negative. That was my negative. But lots and lots of really positive things. So I love teaching. I think I enjoy teaching, and I specifically enjoy teaching archaeology because of the way that thinking about the past is a way of thinking critically about society and culture in the present and future as well. So I enjoy that. And I enjoy, with perhaps particularly this is the case for teaching, but maybe it's generally, I like that you don't get to sit still. So there's always such a learning curve. I'm always learning something new. I'm involved in supervising new students who are doing new things. And as soon as I finish teaching one course, figuring out how to teach at one level, you're perhaps this is in fact a negative, that there is that sense that academic archaeology is a little bit like a cake eating competition where the prize is more cake, right? That as soon as you've figured out how to run a course at undergraduate level, you have to figure out how to do it at masters, and then you're running a PhD course, and then and I'm not being very coherent now.
No, that makes sense to me. From my perspective, it's always like you feel you've achieved. I mean, this is true of academia. I feel is every time you feel on top of something, and there's never a fist punching the air moment of let's have that moment. It's like a little triumph moment at the end of a Rocky film, and then you go, right, what's next? I suppose that's true of any job, isn't it? There's always another challenge coming, and you never feel secure in what you've achieved, but.
No.
So it's a blessing and a curse.
Totally, because the positive side is that continued steep learning curve, and I enjoy that you're always meeting new people, learning new things, doing new stuff, trying to create new projects and so on. I enjoy that. That's great. The other thing I enjoy about it is working with so many different people and also internationally. So I'm on a daily basis in contact with colleagues in different countries, working on different topics. That's great. And I think since my PhD is relatively lonely, at least it was for me, because I was doing kind of very much my own project, not connected to anybody else. But nowadays I do much more collaborative work, which I really enjoy. So now on this project, I have a close colleague who I'm working with, editing Current Swedish Archaeology, which is Sweden's kind of internationally directed archaeological journal. There I work with Sophie Bergbrandt from Gothenburg University. And that kind of collaboration, having somebody, shared goals, working together, somebody to discuss what we're doing, somebody to make those decisions with, that's great. I really like that. And so, I think, in fact, the colleagues with whom I choose to work are one of the really big positives about academic archaeology.
Well, that's wonderful to hear, and it sounds like you've had some really great experiences. I remember meeting Sophie back in 2005 when I went to Stockholm to do a presentation, I think, or something back in the day. I think she was doing a PhD on Bronze Age costumes and textiles, or that type of thing. But and I think she presented me a copy of her thesis at the time. I think I've still got it on my shelf at work. So that's there's some really good people in Swedish archaeology. I happen to know anyway, and I think we have many shared acquaintances that are positive. And I think they can really keep things going and inspire you. I mean, I also wanted to ask about. Perhaps a final question, because I have kept you a long time, but I mean, I'm very interested in the coronavirus phenomenon, and whether from a Swedish academic perspective or a more broader perspective, how has it affected your work? You mentioned earlier it had affected, your ability to do an international project, but what's your take on the what's happened and what's happening, what's going to happen in terms of academia and in relation to coronavirus, your ability to do teaching research.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, in sort of simple practical terms, it has been difficult because it happened just as I was kind of launching a project with colleagues in lots of different countries, lots of travel planned, and a lot of that travel was important in terms of communicating our research, but also finding out about evidence in other regions and in the preceding period. Lots of council conferences where I had meetings set up with people I really wanted to talk to. And of course, you can talk on the internet, but it is not the same in terms of establishing sort of trust and ongoing relationships and work. So that's been difficult. While I'm doing this project, the only teaching that I'm doing is at PhD level. And that has worked, and I think does work relatively well online. So I'm running courses with limited numbers, so sort of 20 or so PhD students who are all super motivated, super used to the technology. They want to get the most out of every interaction. So that kind of teaching has been much less difficult, much less painful, much less energy draining for me than I think for colleagues who are teaching in different circumstances. In terms of, let me see, the long term. So one of the really positive things is that those PhD courses specifically, we've been able to open to students in other countries because we're running it online anyway.
Yeah.
Might as well. So that means that you get a bigger student group, you get more experiences, you get more different kinds of topics, you get different personalities. Really good. And I think, and I hope that that will continue to be the case for some of our teaching, that it's going to be more open and more international. I think that I've really appreciated having more lectures, more talks online, and being able to hear from colleagues that I would otherwise have to travel a very long way to see. I know that, I mean, especially for colleagues who have mobility issues, this has been in lots of ways brilliant. So my mother is an academic. She's a historian. And she can't really travel nowadays because she's not very well. But now suddenly she can go to everything. She can go to all of the meetings. She can hear all of the talks. It's great. So I hope that perhaps we will always have the sort of mixed media, so that there's an online option for people who want it. That's great. But at the same time, I think it's beginning to feel stretched in terms of meeting colleagues and being able to have those more extended and rambling conversations that in fact are the basis for collaboration and trust and cooperation, and also firing up ideas.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think that's summarised a lot of my feelings on it without going into a massive long rant about sort of some of the ongoing frustrations. But I think there will be positives coming out of it, and the very fact that we were able to have this conversation. I've forced myself to set up this YouTube channel, because I think that you're someone who's not like really should be. You're one of the gurus of early medieval archaeology in my mind, but you're not spouting off on social media all the time. You've been very quiet. So I think it's really a privilege to have you on this venue, and I hope you appear in many other similar sort of digital environments, Ali, because I think you are one of the people that I think the broader early medieval enthusiast community need to hear a lot more from, and your publications and the links to them I think are going to be a nice little resource here on this channel that people can link to. But equally, I must say I'm so excited to hear about these forthcoming papers and this ongoing work. I should say, before we finish, I have to give a shout out to Andrew Reinhard, the guru of video gaming archaeology, for providing me with this background. This is from Assassin's Creed Valhalla. This is Sutton Hoo in the 9th century, apparently, where I think you can rob some treasure. So I thought I couldn't resist but use that as a backdrop for talking to you about grave robbing. So thank you, Andrew, for letting me utilise the screen grab from your video gaming. So a fictional Sutton Hoo there just to provide a bit of a theme. But I mean, I think we've kind of covered everything I wanted to cover in this this Archaeodeath video. So if it's okay with you, Ali, I'd like to sort of sign off. Have you got any sort of final thoughts or anything else you'd like to throw at the viewers?
No, I am glad that you're doing these video talks, because as we were saying at the beginning, nowadays especially there is a lot of just communicating in writing, and it is actually worth taking that kind of extra time to chat to people as well.
Well, I hope we can chat further, and we've not shamelessly plugged the book in which our co-authored article on Vikings and the Vikings comes out in, but we can talk about that another time. But our grave reopening and funerary archaeology interests sort of have synergized there, and I hope they do again in future. But for now, I shall say farewell, Ali, and thank you for watching, everyone, and well, hopefully we'll have some more interviews in due course.
Thank you very much, Howard.
For relaxing times, make it Archaeodeath time.